And again, I'm not zooming far because I'm staying here in Cape Town, and I'm saying hello to Daniel Silke, who is a political economy analyst. A political economy analyst. Daniel, how are you?
Nils, I'm very good under the circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely, the circumstance. A political economy analyst. I think it's a wonderful mixture, or a explosive mixture to mix, especially in our regions. Political economy, politics and economics don't always work that well, and especially when a crisis like COVID hits. Give us a snapshot of what is happening right now as far as our region, sub-Saharan Africa, let's say, or Africa, the entire continent. What would you say is the in a few sentences, the snapshot on the whatever it is today, end of July?
Well, look, I think from an African perspective, north of our borders, we've seen a more manageable outbreak of COVID-19. Although I think there are still substantial doubts about the effectiveness of testing and the availability of real data coming out from many jurisdictions. Overall, it has not been clearly as serious as the outbreak here in South Africa. So we are beginning to see some of those African markets at least opening up in terms of international travel. And you're starting to see some of the global airlines, Emirates and some others, begin to fly into East Africa in particular, Tanzania even. And in fact, the interesting thing is that in Tanzania, where the US State Department had issued a warning about COVID-19, the official data has been somewhat less threatening, and we are seeing the return of some international air bridges and linkages. So it's a mixed picture across the board, but I think broadly speaking, we will see those African countries and Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, even Ethiopia to some degree, begin to open up, begin to integrate more with the outside world, and strangely enough, leaving South Africa behind, given our own desire to keep our borders closed and to suspend all international air services. And I do think, Niels, that over time we're going to find that those looking at Africa, both from a business and a tourism perspective, will clearly wish to revisit the other parts of the continent. And South Africa is in fact going to be, at least temporarily, the loser in this battle. It's a competitive environment out there for both hotel rooms, for visitors, and frankly, if you can have a greater freedom of movement in Nairobi, or going to a safari in Kenya or Tanzania, and you can't do that in South Africa, those tourism dollars and those hotel investment dollars are likely to be spent, at least initially, in those parts of the continent. So we see South Africa actually sort of regulating herself into a less than competitive position when compared to some of the other jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's indeed a sad situation and indictment on the current, certainly the current leadership as far as those aspects are concerned. Now, focusing on West Africa and the reliance on business travel, because a lot of it, if I look at Nigeria, that undoubtedly an international tourism or leisure tourism potential of this big country isn't quite as developed as in other countries like South Africa, like Tanzania, like Kenya. It's more regional and international business travel that keeps that sector alive. What's the situation in West Africa as far as you know?
Now, I think it's going to be relatively slow in West Africa. I think it's going to be more your East African markets that are going to be at least the sort of initial beneficiaries of the beginnings of an opening up. The West African story, I think, is going to be a lot slower. I think the Nigerian story is going to be a lot slower as well. But I do think that from a business perspective, we know across Africa that there is going to be a relatively significant drop in per capita income for many African countries, if not all of them. This will result in the slowing or retardation of a burgeoning middle class. And we've always spoken over many years about the importance of encouraging both business and domestic leisure tourism in many growing African markets. And I think, unfortunately, a softening of that middle class and their disposable income as a result of COVID-19 is also going to put a dampener on that domestic tourism that one would have hoped to have encouraged during these times. So I think that's a factor that's going to retard not only West Africa, but perhaps some other African markets as well. And I also, I think it's also important just from a broader business perspective across the continent, is that African governments really are going to have to come to the party on a number of policy fronts and initiatives if they are to retain a high level of foreign direct investment. And you only have to look, Nils, at some of the South African businesses that over the last few months or so, as a result of COVID, but not purely as a result of COVID, have decided to pull some of their operations out of Nigeria, or even out of Kenya for that matter. I'm thinking here of some retail companies in South Africa who feel that the regulatory environment, the currency environment in particular, the ability to extract funds in foreign currency has become so difficult and so onerous that it is, in fact, despite the growing populations and the growing promise of African demographic boom over the next decade, 2 or 3 or 10 for that matter, these companies are deciding to play it safe under the guise of COVID and extract themselves from markets that have become a little bit more difficult to operate. So there is a double whammy operating across Africa when it comes to both the regulatory environment and, of course, the effects of COVID. And both of them are having an effect of making businesses a little bit more reticent to commit, certainly in the short term, despite the fact that I still am an African bull. And when you look at those demographic figures for West Africa in particular, and what's interesting about Nigeria in particular is the new figures have come out, fantastic study from the Lancet journal just in the last 10 days or so, that shows that by 2100, Nigeria won't be the 3rd biggest country population-wise in the world anymore, which I've always spoken about. It'll be the 2nd biggest population center in the world. And in fact, it will be ahead of China in terms of head of the populations. A big demographic reduction and readjustment is going to take place in China as a result of an aging population and lower fertility rates there. So, Africa to me is still the place to be from a consumer perspective going forward, but the regulatory side of the equation has to match the expectation of demand going forward.
Yeah, and now the economic fundamentals or economic leadership that is required and things that are now put into place. Europe, massive subsidies packages, 750 billion, I think it was just last week, which they really fought through a lot. The US doing a lot. South Africa has pledged, I think, 500 billion, out of which 200 billion apparently or allegedly have already disappeared. So all this leadership aspect of providing relief, wanting to help stabilize the demise of the middle class that you mentioned, which was just starting to grow and mitigate some of the other circumstances. So corruption and the fighting thereof. What do you see? Is there? Are we winning? Are we going further back due to Corona? Does it make it easier to make money disappear?
Well, I certainly think in the South African story, we've had a particularly unpleasant series of allegations regarding corruption in procurement, in particular for COVID relief supplies, just in the course of the last week. And those issues are really unfolding as we speak, both in the Eastern Cape and, for that matter, very close to the office of the President Ramaphosa himself. And I certainly think that what can one say about it, Nils? It's a case of really one would expect better in South Africa's time of deep need. This is a humanitarian crisis in South Africa. If the default position within the state is still greed and nefarious activities like feathering your own nest, it really calls into question the ability of the state, frankly, to manage some of the recovery measures that include large-scale physical infrastructure projects in South Africa. We know that for President Ramaphosa, one of the ways in which government wants to dig itself out of its economic crisis here is to spend big when it comes to water, transport, sanitation, housing, railroads, power. All of those issues require extensive regeneration, to put it mildly. But if your default is corruption on COVID, you've really got to have financial management systems in place to manage these huge billions of dollars that government is trying to raise and will, in the next few weeks, announce some major plans on in terms of upgrading South Africa. So, I think that there really is a problem for government now within its own ranks. Perhaps, in a sense, it's good that we see the limitations on government even under COVID, and that will put pressure on government, I believe, to really try and instill an oversight role, perhaps for the private sector in particular, on the disbursement of funds going forward. And that will be the critical issue as to whether this recovery package for South Africa that is yet to be announced, I might add, you've seen the temporary stopgap of the 500 billion, you're quite right, but that's just the relief funds. What we really need is to build back and build back better, as the slogan goes. Every conference next year or the next 2 years will have build back better as its theme, I might add, Nils. But ultimately, the oversight of that building back is going to make or break us.
My goodness, the time has run away again. Silver lining, Daniel, silver lining for Africa, silver lining for sub-Saharan Africa. If you had to project yourself into 12, 18 months' time, how will we look back on this?
Yeah, I sort of get the feeling that, we're moving in quite rapid time. I've always said COVID time is quick time. Things change very rapidly. And I don't see this particular difficulty that all of us have as being, an extended long-term issue. I think this is a medium-term issue that will largely be, I think, alleviated or offset with a rollout of a relatively effective vaccine. Even if that vaccine is rolled out slowly, I believe that there will be enough immunity built into that rollout of vaccine that we'll be able to return to at least semi-normal lives in the medium term. On the basis of that, the fundamentals don't really change. We have a world population eager to do business. We have an African continent still open for business, certainly amongst many of the African countries. And I think the issue of infrastructure development is going to be huge, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere as well. And I think the impetus for infrastructure becomes even greater under COVID. The well-being of populations becomes a priority. And that really does take huge amounts of money, big investments, and a lot of business and a lot of transport and traffic between the rest and Africa. And on that basis, I think we will resume this perhaps on steroids in a good way in the course of the next 2 to 3 years.
I think that would be good to have that and to also connect Africa with itself a little bit, a lot more than we currently have, because I believe that there are major opportunities to do that. Daniel Silke, the political economy analyst, thank you so much for your time. I send best regards, and next time we must do this with a coffee or on a glass of wine. At the moment it's forbidden. We do it with a coffee.
I look forward to either. Thank you, Nils.
Thanks, Daniel. Take care.